As for the media reports you cited, I think I'd like to use the term President Trump often loves to say and call them fake news.
That was China's Vice Minister of Commerce using one of President Donald Trump's favorite lines against him. He's referring to accusations of intellectual property theft. But clever quips aren't the only thing up China's sleeve today. The world's second largest economy announced plans for more tariffs on a slew of American exports. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce says it plans to impose a 25% tariff on $50 billion worth of U.S. exports. The 106 affected products include soybeans, planes, cars, whiskey, and chemicals. It is clearly a direct response to the Trump administration's intention to target 1,300 Chinese exports with 25% tariffs there. None of this is a done deal, though. Neither side announced a date for when this new wave of tariffs would take effect. And China's vice finance minister says there is time to negotiate and cooperate. But Beijing has shown a willingness to fight back. On Monday, it put into effect tariffs on about $3 billion worth of U.S. imports. Those measures were a response to earlier U.S. tariffs on steel and aluminum. Washington called Beijing's objections to U.S. steel and aluminum tariffs completely baseless, and there's no justification to impose $3 billion in retaliatory tariffs. As he so often does, President Trump responded earlier in the day on Twitter. We're not in a trade war with China. That war was lost many years ago by the foolish or incompetent people who represented the U.S. Now we have a trade deficit of $500 billion a year with intellectual property theft of another $300 billion. We cannot let this continue. Went on to say, when you're already $500 billion down, you can't lose. Larry Kudlow is President Trump's newly appointed economic advisor. He downplayed the situation, saying it's all part of the process. Here's what he had to say when asked about the president's tweets.
I'm not sure what exactly he's referring to.
Could we lose a trade war?
No. How's that?
To get more insight into the escalation of the trade spat between China and the U.S., we're joined by Howard Balloch in Jamestown, Rhode Island. He is a former Canadian ambassador to China and a longtime businessman now based in Beijing and in Hong Kong. It's nice to see you again, sir. I wonder, when you look at how the last 36, 24 hours have played out, are we closer now to an actual trade war breaking out between these two countries?
I don't think we're closer than we were last week. I think today was a pretty horrible day for people with minor heart problems. They probably have serious heart problems now. And I think we're probably going to see more of this in the weeks to come. Unfortunately, every time the adults seem to get a hold of the agenda and put some process in a negotiating process for going forward, somebody, we know who, tends to send out a tweet that aggravates the situation once again. So I don't think we're any closer to a trade war, but I don't think we've avoided one yet either.
Right. And as you say, the American response, a lot of people are saying it's a little shoot from the hip. It's certainly a little emotional. You know the Beijing players in this better than most people I speak with. How calculated was Beijing's response? Specifically, I mean, they got very political in targeting, say, soybean farmers, for example.
Yeah. Beijing's response is extremely targeted, extremely strategic. Not only have they targeted some major supporters or areas of support for Trump, but they've also been very careful to make sure that they don't do more than retaliate or threaten to retaliate in a measured way, exactly proportionate to the American threats. And I think it was and they also advised the WTO that they were going to do it and why they were doing it. I think the Chinese have been extremely measured in this, and they have offered to the United States, by doing so, a pathway to resolution of this through a negotiating process. Whether the United States can actually sit down and negotiate sensibly over this, I don't know. The trade deficit that the United States runs with China is not going to go away overnight. It is more structural than tariff-related, and while some of the issues, token tariff changes, and perhaps some change in the investment rules can be achieved through negotiations, negotiations aren't going to lead to a balance in merchandise trade. They're just not.
Howard, you won't be able to see this, but I want our viewers at home to take a look at a map we have here. This is a look at the grain silos of soybean production in the United States. It's like a heat map for Trump support through the Rust Belt. It is so remarkable to me in that they chose soybean farmers in particular, something that won't have a huge impact on trade inflows or outflows, but that targets his base of political support in a way that, you know, this is really calculated political thinking in a way that I think we would only give credit to a domestic player in doing that. I wonder, with that in mind, what is the next step? You talk about there are ways and there are hopes that they can sort of negotiate their way out of this and climb this down. Where is that next opportunity? Is it the end of these public comments and that public hearing we have in May 15th? And is the time between that a cooling off? I mean, what happens now?
Well, I think you may be asking for a singular actor to cool off who's shown absolutely no tendency to cool off in the past. But if the two sides can sit down, and if there can be a few, you know, Trump was talking about the 25% tariff on cars. That's probably not terribly important in China anymore. Now they've got their own domestic industry, largely fueled by foreign joint ventures, General Motors and Ford and Mercedes and BMW and so on. And so some token change in the tariff structure will probably help. Some further movement on investment rules will certainly help. That will allow the Americans to claim some sort of advance, maybe then another process that goes on for a year or so to leave the tariffs in kind of semi-permanent abeyance. I don't think you're going to see the Americans remove the threat of tariffs entirely at the end of anything in the next few months, but at least putting them off indefinitely is a probable outcome, I would guess.
And just lastly, sir, the Chinese ambassador to the United States is at the State Department today. These were previously planned meetings, but I wonder if you have a sense of how tense those meetings must be today for diplomats on either side of that table.
I would say they would be firm. I wouldn't say they would be tense. I think the Chinese must be saying very clearly what they're saying publicly, maybe with a renewed or an emphasis on, look, let's sit down and talk about these things. This is a terrible way to conduct business between two countries, and it doesn't do anybody any good to ignite a public anger over these things, because it then makes changes and compromises much harder to achieve. Again, I do see a lot of adult behavior in the substance of the American response, the public meetings, the time to discuss, and also the selection of the goods that they focused on China were the ones that are not going to be the ones that are going to hurt American firms or American consumers as much as they could have. iPhones and electronic equipment are largely off the list, at least modern stuff. And so there are people who are trying to act in a measured way here. And so we can only hope that they're going to be the ones in charge of the process, not those who tweet.
All right. We always appreciate your insights, sir. Thank you so much for making the time. China-based businessman Howard Balloch, former Canadian ambassador to China.